Well, we're so pleased and delighted to welcome Llyn to Danaan, a noted South Sound author, a cultural anthropologist, and emerita faculty from the Evergreen State College. She's going to be speaking on her new book, Gale, A Coastal Salish Woman's Life on Oyster Bay. She details the life of Katie Kettle Gale, a woman whose life is a study in the changes brought by 19th century Euro-American settlement. And you probably heard a lot about this book. It's had a lot of acclaim already. And you'll hear more about this remarkable woman. I apologize, we kind of got our wires crossed. We do not have our books for sale here, but Llyn will tell you where they are for sale here in town. So with that, join me in welcoming Llyn to Danaan.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me know if you can't hear me. I can always speak a little louder. Is my volume okay right now? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Shanna. This is a long day coming to get this book finished and out there. Many of you in this room have, I would say, at some levels, suffered with me through the years of working on this book, and many of you have helped me and supported me and celebrated with me at every stage of the game. I am very pleased that you're here, and I do hope that many of you will get the book and read it if you haven't already. Orca Books definitely has the book, and I'll be reading there Friday night and signing. But if you have books or get books in another way and want me to sign, call me up. I live on Oyster Bay, so I'm very close by. I woke up this morning very early, and at some point I was sitting at my computer and I thought somebody was shining a floodlight into my study. I seriously didn't know what was happening, and I ran outside and I saw the sun rising over Oyster Bay, and I was so thrilled by what I saw. And Mount Rainier is right across the bay and clear as a bell. The sun was rising, and I thought, I am blessed for this day. This is a sign that all is good. The bay says, go on, girl, go for it. And so I'm happy, and I can see the smiles on your faces that many of you had that experience this morning of seeing that sun. I understand it's been pretty foggy around here. Well, it was a good day, and it is a good day. The name of this, well, first I should say I am a PhD cultural anthropologist. I'm not officially a historian, but I do a lot of cultural history. And my focus has been the cultural history of Oyster Bay, and I'll say a little bit more about that. I am a freelance writer. Over the last 10 years, I kind of shifted, I quit working full-time. That allowed me to shift to writing and independent research. And I just write and do research on whatever the heck I want to write and do research about. And I get it out however I can get it out. And that means I'm on nobody's payroll. And means also I'm beholden to nobody, and I don't have to get up in the morning, and as long as I keep my garden and live relatively simply, I'm good to go. But I'm sure many of you are in that situation, and we're all having to live relatively simply now, so it makes no difference. You'll learn in this book, how many of you have purchased, I shouldn't say have purchased, but how many of you have the book in some form or another and have started reading it? So some of you already know this, and it's really more than the life of a woman named Katie Gale. It's really also a critical history of this region around the time of territorial government, around the time of the wars of 1856, and up till about 1900, so after statehood. I really try to put her life in a context of both regional, state, and national history. It makes sense to do that. And she becomes a person through her life. You can see the impact that all the changes of those periods had on an individual person. And she's an individual person who is an Indian Native American woman who is married to a white man who came to Oyster Bay in 1878 to work in the oyster industry, well, to create a commercial oyster industry. There was no commercial industry in terms of buying and selling oysters at that time. So he was a person critical to that. Together, they worked and acquired tidal lands and had an oyster business. And the story that unfolds in this is their relationship and ways in which she made it her business to maintain that land, a half of it, in her name, so that she could leave it to her children. So that's kind of the crux of the matter in terms of her own story here. A woman who said at a time that it was very possible that that land would be lost, the tide lands, said no and took her husband to court and maintained and managed to keep that land and get that land in her name. So that's unwise. And of course, in order to understand all of that, you have to know the national economy. You have to know the state economy. You have to know what was happening with tide lands. So all of that is brought into play as you read the book. I live on Oyster Bay. I've lived there for 40 years. I've actually probably lived there longer than Katie Gale lived there now, because she only lived to be about 43 years old, according to the record. And she would have moved there into Mud Bay and Oyster Bay area after 1856 when she was born, probably more likely in the 1860s. Before I read a passage to you, and what I will do is read some passages, make a few more comments, and give you time to ask some questions at the end. And also, those of you who have read, I would like to hear what you're experiencing thus far in reading the book. But I want to especially thank the people who gave me the spiritual guidance for this work. And they are really mentors, friends, and teachers of mine. And one of them is David Whitener, who has passed. And I really wanted Barbara to be here, Barbara Whitener, today, to give me the spiritual support that I need to go ahead with this work and to represent David. Another one was Judy Wright, and she was the cultural historian for the Puyallup tribe, for whom I worked beginning in 1990. And Judy Wright, as a Puyallup woman, gave me an enormous amount of information about how to work in archives, how to work in histories. And up until that time, as an anthropologist, I had not worked in archives. I had done field work, and most of it in Southeast Asia. And so this was a whole new field for me when I started working on the shellfish case for the Puyallup tribe. And then I also want to acknowledge Midge, or Margaret Ward Quilliot, also passed. And it was Midge who approached me one day when I was working on the Evergreen State College Tacoma campus and said, "The Puyallup needs you." And I had no idea what a door she was opening for me. And I always treasure the memory of Midge Ward. So I wanted to be clear that those are the people that made all this work possible and really did guide it. So now I'm going to read Chapter 1 of Katie Gale, A Coast Salish Woman's Life on Oyster Bay. Chapter 1, My Lodestone. Katie Kettle Gale was born into violence in an era of violence. As a child, she was surrounded by people who had lost everything and to whom promises from the government seemed not to mean much. She was close to Chief Kettle, a man whom her kin, James Tobin, said was wary of Indian women marrying white men. His words and warnings must have been repeated to her often as life with her husband, Joseph Gale, a white man, became unbearable. Pete Bloomfield was the catalyst for this story. Pete grew up at Camilche Point on Puget Sound in Washington State, where his father, Charles James Bloomfield, had acquired an 80-acre plot. Charles worked for the Olympia Oyster Company in addition to working his own land. Pete, born in 1923, started logging in the area in 1948. He had long remembered a day in the late 1950s when he was felling trees around Oyster Bay, scant miles from Camilche Point. He had his own logging outfit then. It was called Bloomfield Logging Company. On that day, he came across some tombstones deep in the woods. It was common for early homesteaders, ranchers, and farmers to bury their deceased near their home and on their own property, so there was nothing particularly unusual about his find. Many of these little plots have been long since forgotten and overgrown as land has changed hands and descendants have abandoned the rural life for other prospects. Most of these graves are never visited, and many have been desecrated. Many tombstones have been broken or stolen, and some graves have been dug up and robbed of their contents. Pete's mind must have wandered back to that little plot on and off through the years. That memory just wouldn't go away. It was one of those things he always meant to do something about. So one day, he got into his car and drove into downtown Shelton, the administrative seat of Mason County, Washington. He pulled up in front of the little repurposed Carnegie Library building that contains the artifacts and documents cared for by the Mason County Historical Society. Billy Howard, the director, was probably sitting, as always, behind a desk that allows her to see anyone who comes in through that door. Shirley Earhart was there if it was Tuesday. Shirley is a bloodhound on the trail when it comes to finding great source material. She can spot in an instant something she knows I'll be interested in as she peruses newspaper files and dusty ledgers. Her memory for what she's seen and where she's seen it is enviable. I often receive the bounty of her serendipitous finds, a bundle of copied clippings in my mailbox along with a cheery note. Stan Graham, a part-time employee of the museum and a retired assistant fire management officer, was there. He fought fires for Olympic National Forest for 29 seasons and then turned his attention to his longtime love, local history. He's a big, bright, inquisitive and garrulous fellow. Stan listened to Pete carefully. He knew the spot Pete was talking about was near my house, so he gave me a call. Stan was aware I'd worked for Puget Sound Tribes for a year and knew of my growing absorption with documenting the cultural and economic history of Oyster Bay. We had some common interests, and I'd mentored him through his effort to catalog the prairies of the Olympic Peninsula. He helped me learn to read and use mid-19th century survey maps while I was working for the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. So on a summer day in 2004, Stan and Jan Parker, who also worked at the museum, picked me up at my place. My house is on the way to the site, just a half a mile from the driveway that leads to the Olympia Oyster Company, near where Pete had said he remembered seeing the markers. As we bounced along gravel roads in Stan's oversized pickup, I examined a small-scale map on which Pete had marked a huge black X with a felt pen. We had clippers, loppers, pruners, leather gloves, and a couple of cameras with us. After a few inconclusive inquiries at company houses located on the incline above Oyster Bay, we hacked our way up a bushy hill we thought might be the right one. It had been enthusiastically overgrown with alders and blackberries since Pete's decades-old clearing. Through vines and branches, we saw, all at the same time, what we were looking for. We shouted to each other, "Look, we found it." It seemed so unlikely. We were astonished at our own capacity for sleuthing. We had been given so few clues, and the territory where the plot might have been was immense. Now silent, aware that this was a sacred space, we walked toward the stones amid the ivy and brush. There were several visible. We knelt near the biggest block. This inscribed slab leaned against a gray, stout, moss-covered base. It took a few minutes to make out the letters through the lichen and discoloration on the monument. "The children of Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," it read, "Hattie and Henry." Henry died in 1895 at age 17. Hattie died in 1897 at age 18, according to the inscription. We stood a few moments thinking about these children. We wondered out loud about the causes of their death and imagined the grief of losing so close together in time two nearly grown children. Then we saw another pillar. It was a column of cool pink granite engraved in low relief with twin doves. It was lying, unbroken and still smooth as silk, on the ground beside its base. Stan lifted it. The face read, "Katie, wife of J.A. Gale, died August 6, 1899, aged 43 years. Gone but not forgotten." Katie Gale. It eventually made sense. Henry and Hattie were Katie's children from before she married Joseph Gale. The J.A. noted on the stone was Gale. Katie was, I knew, the Kitty Gale talked about in late 19th century accounts of life on Oyster Bay. She was an Indian woman who had her own oyster business and who stood up for her rights, the stories said. She was known by other names, including George and Kettle and Kittle. I came to know later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. At the moment, I was simply thrilled. I had wondered for years about the woman I'd barely caught a glimpse of in an old memoir by Cora Chase and in the yellowed ledgers that recorded 19th century title transactions in the Washington State Archives. I'd always believed there was a story to be told about Katie. Now here was her grave, less than a mile down the road from my own Oyster Bay home. I went a bit crazy, I suppose, because Stan finally let me know I was hooting and pounding on his shoulders and back, and maybe I'd like to stop now. It was hard to stave off the excitement because, though I knew little about Katie Gale, I was absolutely and instantly convinced that this was the opening of a new chapter for Katie and for me. So, though I worked for Puget Sound Tribes beginning in about 1990, it's only been the past 10 years, as I said, that I've had really time to do full-time research and writing. So, through these past 10 years, between teaching abroad a couple of times and other travel, I've managed to produce a body of work that focuses on the cultural history of Oyster Bay. I even have a Facebook site, if you do Facebook, called the Oyster Bay Literary Society. There's not much literary about it, but there's a lot of news about Oyster Bay and oysters and nice photographs of Oyster Bay, and I always invite poets and writers and photographers who live around the bay to please post things. So there is that. If you're interested, you can contribute. My own work includes boxes of research, now at the Evergreen State Archives, about Katie Gale, and several pieces including tapes, archive video, photographs about the Japanese-American presence on Oyster Bay, and I have published some things about those folks and their work. Some of you, if you read the Columbia magazine, may have seen the piece I did on the poets of Oyster Bay, Japanese-American people, men and women, who wrote a poetry called senryu, a form that's very much like haiku. In fact, there's one poem on the table down at Percival Landing by Mrs. Abo, thanks to the Arts Commission of Parks Department. Thank you for a correction on. So that work is out there, and the book, I guess this book and that work too, and some of the other work that I've been doing really represents my effort to witness for and on behalf of people who are not witnessing or not speaking for themselves at this particular moment in time. That is, to put their lives and their contributions to our history into the record at some level. So it's an act of witnessing, but it's also, I read something by Terry Tempest Williams the other day, and she talked about how many of us are looking for a way, and I like this quote, looking for a way to vocalize, perform, act out, and address the commonly felt crises of our time. And this, she believes, is a spiritual act, the attempt to somehow put out there what we're experiencing or have experienced as important moments in our own history that perhaps can inform us about a future that might be better, kinder, juster. So more just, I suppose that should be. She talked about this being a spiritual work, and I have to say that this, it rang true for me, that there's nothing about doing this work that wasn't at some level emotionally compelling and deeply moving to me. And I suppose for that, I would call that spiritual work, a deep and transformative work in my own life. Now, I will read a couple more excerpts here. I think I want to read, I did mark something here. I'll speak a little bit of it. This is from the chapter, Katie Gale's Early Life. And this is about the wartime in the 1856 period. And it's talking about Fox Island, the place where Katie was very likely born. And it basically was a concentration camp during that period. Native peoples of Western Washington had to go by order of then Governor Stevens to these camps or risk being shot if they were not in the camps. So this is a little piece about Fox Island. If one takes the record of supplies sent to Fox Island as representative of what was available for sustenance in the camp, the Indian people who had for generations feasted on the abundance of returning fish runs, seasonal berries, roots, bulbs, wild green vegetation, and moist succulent shellfish, since anyone could remember, seem to have been expected to live on flour and molasses. There wasn't even much of that. Some of the Fox Island internees got permission to go to their homes or to old territories of relatives up on Carr Inlet with seed potatoes to plant. These families and individuals, no doubt, became stronger because they could gather plants and hunt while they were there hoeing and planting. They could do some fishing. The people who never left Fox Island became weak and despairing. People died every day in wretched conditions. They couldn't leave until the government said they could, and were trapped in their despondency, watching each other waste away. In spite of what was surely a harsh beginning, Katie must have been told and later remembered the stories her mother and other kin related during her childhood. Perhaps tales were told to keep up morale or to be sure the culture wasn't completely lost. Perhaps people told of mythic adventures and heroic feats to distract the children from the pain and fear and sorrow so many felt. Some of the narratives were epics that required several nights to bring to a conclusion. Thus, children as well as adults would look forward to the next episodes and be perhaps distracted from their misery. Katie heard many tales about the mountain they called Tahoma before it was called Rainier. She knew stories about the changer who created human beings from other creatures and bestowed on them the rudiments of culture. She surely remembered the narratives that celebrated determination, survival, and transformative possibilities. She would have heard sagas of thunderbird and whale. She would know the dramas of blue jay and beaver. Some among those who survived and spoke to Katie would be experts at telling the tales and recounting wonderful deeds in detail. These stories taught her that the world was not always like this hard one she lived in. Of that she remained certain until she died. The stories taught her that the bitterest times contained possibilities of renewal. They taught her that people are different from one another, each unique, and some not particularly nice or to be trusted. The stories taught her that change was the way of the universe. There were always new ways to learn, new challenges to face, new faces to greet, new masks to don, new rivers to cross, and new stars to explore. When she would have wondered, did this change, the change she had witnessed already in her life, the one that led to this life she was caught up in, begin? I want to read a little bit about the research itself. And this is chapter 16. It's called The Marks Upon Her Body. I think I better have a little water. Can you hear me? Everybody hear me? Sometime in my student days, I read that power makes marks upon the body and soul of those on whom that power is exercised. These marks made by power can be as deep and damaging as those inflicted by a bludgeon. I understood from what I studied that physical consequences come from authority and control, misdirected or abused. I also learned firsthand, as many of us have, the regretful agony one experiences in a fatally flawed relationship. But I didn't really understand how the use and abuse of power in such a relationship derives its legitimacy from the culture and society in which it is embedded. I didn't understand how culture can offer approval of and make to seem reasonable the mutilation, punishment, and destruction that power works on lives it touches. After my acquaintance with Katie and Joseph Gale, all of this was no longer theoretical. I came to understand that which was beyond me. In 2004, October 2004, wow, it's October, my hands hovered above a case file, a folio of papers perhaps untouched since they were first placed in an archival box many years, if not decades ago. The Washington State Archives is located on the state capitol campus, not far from downtown Olympia, right over there. The procedure for entering the archive is not unlike that employed by any other well-run repository for important documents. One must leave bags, pens, and other belongings outside the main research facility. After one signs in, an attendant provides a locker and key. I usually leave everything in that locker except my laptop and a camera. I keep the camera, allowed in this archive, to take photographs of pages of texts and files and maps as I go through materials. Inside the main room where researchers work is a squadron of trimmed, glass-covered, heavy oak tables. Under the glass are territorial and state maps. Along the walls of the room, on heavy shelves, are neat rows of directories, law books, and some filing cabinets with microfilm. On one wall is a substantial clock. It is an antique timepiece secured in a wooden case with a pendulum that audibly ticks away the passing time. Incongruously, on one corner case, there is a statue of Confucius, a gift to the state of Washington from the Republic of China in 1972, during the period when Daniel J. Evans was governor. I sit comfortably at one of the long wooden tables on which I can spread out files I'm studying. I take notes with the pencil and paper provided by the staff. Sometimes I type whole passages into my computer. The archives is the place I go to find official state or county documents, including legal files and tideline records from the 19th and early 20th century. All of those official papers collected by courts, state agencies, and 39 current counties of Washington eventually make their way into the Washington State Archives. These carefully stored documents may be accessed for legitimate research. Delving into the past, into people's lives, is a serious project, and no one here enters that work lightly. The staff's treatment of visitors and file boxes is ritualized, almost sacralized. I like this about archives. I know what to expect. I know that at least this part of my work is predictable. When boxes are retrieved, they are placed on the table before the researcher. Staff provide client with white gloves. Like a surgeon, one handles the contents of boxes gently and with swathed fingers. One slips each old paper out of its file with great delicacy. One follows the rules. Anyone who loves doing historical research will tell you that at this moment, when the cartons full of numbered file folders are before you, in this state of giddy apprehension, when you know you're going to discover something important, your heart is in your throat. On that day in 2004, I pulled a folder from the first box I'd requested. On the opening page of the court record in that file, I read this, in quotes: "The defendant has treated the plaintiff as a menial, has never been kind and loving to her, and has repeatedly struck her, inflicting bruises and wounds upon her person. And on the 8th day of July, 1893, the defendant struck her in the face with his fist. And at the same place, at her home in Mason County, the defendant kicked the plaintiff with his booted feet, inflicting serious and painful wounds upon the person of the plaintiff." I had long since learned to crave the thrill of the chase. I've spent years doing research, first in Sarawak, Malaysia, where I was a young Peace Corps volunteer. Though obliged by my job to build gardens and pit latrines, I found time to study headhunting rituals and labor exchange systems. I visited village farms with young Badayo friends and managed to evade the very dangers of floods, the Brunei Rebellion, the Malaysian confrontation. Soldiers I drank tiger beer with one night in the bazaar of my little 2-block town were sometimes dead the next night, killed on the border with Indonesian Borneo. Still, for all the years of living in often difficult circumstances, witnessing death and disease and even war, and reading documents of a cruel and bitter period in the history of my own region, I hadn't come to terms with the fact that the work I'd chosen to do in my life would often bring me up close to injustices committed against good and decent people. I want to leave time for comments and questions, and I'd love to hear from people who have started the book and have something to say, and other questions as well. So it's your turn. And by the way, if you ask me a question and I say it's in the book, it's not because I want to sell you books. It's because it's taken me so long to get it right that I don't want to try to speak what's actually written down. You know what? You understand what I'm saying? It's in the book. So with that, have I scared away questions? Carla.
So I'm just curious, when you said that reading the name Katie Gale made you think there was a deeper story, what was it that made you think that?
Thank you. Carla says, what made me think that when I first read her name, there was more to the story when I first saw the name Katie Gale. There were two things. That's a good question. There were two things. One was in Cora Chase's book. She repeats a story about Katie Gale having pulled her husband's whiskers and tying them around a tree. And, and that's the story that people had heard. That's what came down. That's what came down. But I thought, wait a minute, just a minute. Have you ever tried to put a man's whiskers around a tree and tie them? So it sounded made up, but it also was said with a great deal of pride by people who had heard this story. It's like she was ahead of her time. But then I came, so I'd seen that little snippet. Cora Chase's parents worked for Katie Gale. So that's in the book. It tells this story. But the other thing was when I went into the title records, this was for other reasons. I was doing some other work. And I was going through these title records and I saw that name, clearly a woman's name, Native American. And I thought, well, this is sort of going against the conventional understanding of the role of Indian women in the oystering in this area. And so it was those two things that made me want to know more, and I hadn't done anything more. She just came to me, I guess. Thanks, Carla. Yes, Carolyn.
Did she and Mr. Gale have children?
Yes. Yes.
How did that affect the inheritance?
Well, she made sure that they inherited. It's very complicated. There's quite a lot about the children. There's a whole chapter on the school, the Oyster Bay School. And I won't tell you about the children. It's a large part of the story. With the sort of divorce or almost divorces 2 times that happened, and how the children played into that, and how he perceived the future of those children, and it's a big part of the story. Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else?
Dorothy, speak up. I've had the joy of reading about maybe a third or a half, and it's completely distracted me from getting anything done this week. And I was so excited. I wrote Llyn, and I just said, I wish this was a Timberland Library Reads. I think every person that lives in our community should be reading this book. At least my lack of knowledge about what went on with the Squaxin people and around the bays and all that, I find it a great resource. But then at the same time, I think Lynn's done a fantastic job of weaving in the how things look. So I'm reading it, a couple mornings ago, and it's all foggy, and she's describing the fog on Oyster Bay and the people out, gathering the oysters, and then all the information about what was going on nationally with the Indian agents, how the Native people were treated, and that they were in concentration camps, and so I'm just a great fan, and I hope I'm sure everybody here will read it, but buy it and get your friends to read it too.
Thanks, Dorothy. I appreciate it. I should just say, as you may have been able to tell from what I've read to you, this is in the genre of literary nonfiction. It's not an academic book, but it's well researched. The footnotes are there, the bibliography is there. But I did not want to write an academic book, and I wanted to write something that was accessible and that potentially could be used in schools and to help educate as I say, witness for the general public. I was struggling with this because I had been an expert witness for the Puyallup tribe for something like 20 years, and I was used to going into courtrooms and having 3 or 4 or 5, 6 pieces of evidence to back up every single thing that I said. And it was very hard for me to make that shift to do this kind of work, and yet I knew that was the way I had to go. And I want to publicly thank Luis Urrea, who wrote me a nice blurb on the book, because I went to a workshop with him in Wallawa. What's that called? Fish trap. And he and his wife, Cindy, really helped me make that leap into being able to imagine parts of this story, as did a historian called Bernard Balin, who is a wonderful historian and who also gave me, not personally, but in reading his work, that the facts don't always tell the story. And so I really had to read and understand how a lot of historians did history in order to be able to make that shift in my own work and make this personal as well as well-researched and as authentic as possible. Somebody over here had a comment.
I just wanted to second Dorothy's comment that it's absolutely amazing to read this book after having lived here for over 30 years. And even though having taught at Evergreen for many years and a close friend and colleague of David Whitener and some familiarity with the tribe, and I lived at Camilchi and so on, to have this story of this big shape of this area that I live in. And you know, you go shopping and you go on I-5 and you worry about Costco and I mean, you know that where we are and what happened here. And you know, it's a real gift to have this book. And I was thinking about growing up in the Bronx, how there's absolutely zero information about any kind of Native presence anywhere in New York when you study in that. It's like it never happened. And it's absolutely extraordinary to have it, and I thank you for it.
I want to just follow that by exhorting you to know your own backyard. It was Gary Snyder who inspired me in the early 70s, and he really, you know, among the other teachers in my life, he really said, you know, put your feet down, put your feet in the sand, stand, know as much about that place that you are occupying as you can possibly know, and know about the people who were there before you, and understand them, and get to know the trees, and get to know the fish, and get to know everything about this piece of land that you occupy on this earth. People have gone there before you. People have suffered before you. People have had joys before you, and it is your job as being a human being to understand that. I really do believe that. And I've tried in my own way to do that. And it's been nothing but rewarding, I can tell you that. So I would love it if our children and our grandchildren would be able to take up that idea themselves and maybe get to know their neighborhood, get to know what was there in the Bronx before PS, what number, Marilyn?
96.
PS 96. Thank you, Shannon.
Well, you gave a wonderful account about your work at State Archives, and I was just wondering if you had other suggestions, particularly about researching Native American women's lives. What other sources did you find exceptionally helpful? And also, I'm just curious, was her gravesite restored or saved? Oh, okay.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
No, and I it's one of my dear hopes that will happen. Resources. Well, you know, one of the things, the first publication of a piece of this work was in the Oregon State Historical Quarterly, and I was asked to submit an article there about the research that I was doing. So if you, and that's online, by the way, you can find that article online. The reason that they asked me to submit an article was that I was trying to reconstruct a woman's life with no primary documents from her, no letters and no journals. So as you read the book, you'll see that I am surrounding her with information that is as close to accurate as I can get. I'm making some guesses, I'm letting you know that I'm imagining, but I didn't have her words except through the court documents. The court documents. And that's as close as I can get to her words. So it's very, very hard. We have lots of material from oral traditions that have been collected by anthropologists, frankly, for the most part. If we were trying to get back into the 1850s, 1860s, we have courtroom documents. The Court of Claims in the 19-teens, their first-person recorded material. Lucy Gerard, who lived on Vashon Island, for example. I've used her words in articles that I've written. The book Vashon Archaeology, there's the ethnographic chapter I wrote. So it's a lot of digging, it's a lot of thinking, like, where else might there be anybody talking about this person, or towards the end, thanks to Steve Lundin, I found a whole court case that involved Sally Hall out on Mud Bay. And in that, Katie Gale's relatives are speaking, James Tobin, telling how the oysters were cultivated on Oyster Bay when he first started. It was a miracle to me to find his words and talking about Chief Kettle and telling about what his role was in the community. So you just keep looking and you just keep digging and you let people know what you're doing, and somebody will come along and say, have you checked this? And that's what Steve did for me. It was like, have you seen this? Oh, unbelievable. So, yeah. Carla.
Well, along those lines, I was just noticing that there are a few photographs, and photographs of that era are
Yes.
really difficult. So
Yes.
How was your experience finding images of
Well, Mason County Historical Society has quite a few of those. One I got from a family member, and then somebody at the Puyallup wrote me an email and said, do you know that Wickersham's photographs are in Alaska, at the Alaska Library? And I didn't. And that turned out that I then was able to find photographs of Mud Bay in 1893. And one of them is in the book. I only used one of them, but I was like, what a miracle. There is a picture of Chief Kettle on Mud Bay in 1893, and it was during the same period that the Shaker Indian Church was being founded in Mud Bay. So again, you just, it's not serendipity exactly, because you let people know what you're up to, and you say, I would love to have any suggestions or help or whatever. Yeah.
Were there tribal historians who helped, or other members of the tribe?
Absolutely. They're listed in the acknowledgments, but certainly, yes. Judy Wright was one at the Puyallup. Yeah. Rhonda Foster. Rhonda, Charlene Kreis. We went through some boxes together. Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. Barbara.
I've always thought, since I came to live here, what a privilege it is to live in a place where Native people are still here, and they're among us. I mean, they're not cordoned off into some concentration camp or something, and they have festivals and contests and performances, and they participate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, especially when I was working at Evergreen and that wonderful longhouse was built, and then that was a place for lots of gatherings and shows of Indian art. And I just feel so lucky to live in this context where these people still are here, living lives, not always perfect lives, but they're here, and we're here too.
And I want to say something about that. I don't pretend to speak for any of the tribes here. This is the reason that I could undertake to do this book, is that it's part of the cultural history of Oyster Bay. It's about intercultural relations. It's about interethnic relations. And so this is not a book that purports to be about the Squaxin tribe or the Puyallup tribe. And I just want to be clear about that because that's not my job.
I take it there's no known descendants of Katie alive today?
That's, I don't want to get too far into that. That's part of the book. But I think, I will honestly tell you, we have tried and tried and tried. And we have, wouldn't it be amazing, and I say this at the end of the book, if because of this book, someone comes forward and says, oh yes, we're still looking. Stan Graham, every once in a while, he gives me a call and he'll say, I think I've got another lead. So we haven't given up. He certainly hasn't given up. But as of now, we have, and I do talk about this towards the end of the book. I talk about what steps were taken, what happened to this person, what happened to that person, and so forth. And including what happened to some of the other people on Mud Bay and Oyster Bay who kind of fall out of the record. So tried to make that as closing of the loop as possible, but it's kind of heartbreaking that we haven't found anybody. Well, I think there's coffee, tea, what, cookies?
Sure.
And if anybody wants it, yeah.
And one more time, your book is available at Orca.
Well, for sure at Orca, and I'd love for you to buy from independent bookstores in town. Yes. So Orca is here. Orca has it. I'm going to be there Friday night. I don't expect you to show up again, but if you do decide, 7 o'clock. Yeah, and then I can sign, but I can sign for anybody that has a book here if you want it signed. But I really enjoyed speaking with you today, and I thank you for your attention. Wonderful.